Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 20th, 2020, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. I'm time traveling a little bit right now because I'm actually out of the country. So the next few episodes are going to be episodes that I recorded before I left. This week's is really exciting. But before we dive into it, I want to thank those of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy possible and to make it free for everyone to download. And that's because of your generous support. If you're interested in supporting the show, just visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Michael Gaucher, Mary Neva, Christopher Pitts, June Sapara, Pasquale Gelate, Ulrika Hagman, Dudas Infinitas, Charles Payet, Brian Holden, Daniel Lang, and David J.E. Smith. Thank you all so freaking much. All right, let's talk about today's show. So I had the opportunity to sit down, not in person, don't worry, via the internet with Dr. Jack Hartnell. Now, he is a lecturer in art history at the University of East Anglia, Norwich, and we talked about his new book. Oh, it's so fascinating. Medieval Bodies, Life and Death in the Middle Ages. So guys, without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Jack Hartnell. Well, Jack, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Great to chat.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about your book, Medieval Bodies, Life and Death in the Middle Ages. I have to admit, when this came across my desk, I was very excited. And then as I started to really dig in, I realized that all the stories that you tell are the, kind of the stories that I expected, but of course with so much more than I ever thought possible. I realized that you're telling them from the perspective of an art historian, not a science historian, not a medical historian, which is such an interesting way to approach this topic.
Yeah, well, actually, it's funny you said that you gave the book its American subtitle, its US subtitle, which is Life and Death in the Middle Ages. But it was originally published in the UK, and it's actually, I don't know, it's come out in a bunch of other languages and places, and I don't know how they've dealt with this. Mm-hmm. But the UK edition the subtitle is Medieval Bodies, Life, Death, and Art in the Middle Ages.
Oh, they just decided to screw that off in the US.
My US publisher said that, no one would buy the book if it had art in the subtitle, which is, of course, soul-crushing for an art historian, especially because, and I guess this answers your question most firmly, and this would be my little pitch for art history. One of the amazing things about dealing with, rather than dealing with historical subjects that are objects, right, that are works of art, that are material culture, visual culture, is that they can't be found to speak for themselves in the same way as historical actors. So we don't find a diary written by a Raphael painting, or we have all sorts of accounts and all sorts of kinds of historical information like we would do. But one thing you lack is that sort of direct connection with actors of the past, as lots of historians of all sorts of things do. But what that means, I think, for art historians is that we're really multidisciplinary people, or interdisciplinary people. So we're constantly thinking about the art that we're looking at in context. And that might mean, for instance, if you were a medievalist and you're looking at an illuminated manuscript all about music, you might have to know everything about medieval music. If you're looking, as I do, at objects of medicine, you have to know everything about medieval medicine. So it's very interconnected in that way. So I wouldn't distance myself at all from historians of medicine. And a lot of what I do is medical history, but I do it often through objects and images.
Oh, I love that. And I mean, I'm looking, that's one of the great things about the book, right? Because it is a kind of medieval bodies. That's, the title, and that's really the central theme, right? It's the physical self.
Absolutely, yeah. And sort of the structure of the book too, because what we wanted to do is, when a medieval author, so I work mainly on Europe in the later Middle Ages, so from the year 1000 through to, say, the year 1500, around then. And when there's a large group of kind of medical texts written in Europe, often in academic settings from that time. And when those individuals came to write about the body, they structured their books like the body that they were investigating. So the first few chapters, might all cures, might run from cures of baldness through to poor eyesight, problems with headache and the brain, all the way down to, I don't know, warts on the soles of your feet. And so that seemed like a really natural structure for me to also adopt. And so the book proceeds from the head all the way down to the feet, chapter by chapter, introducing the reader to different kinds of medical practices, objects associated with medicine, and also cultural responses to the body from sort of top to bottom. A capite ad calcem, as the Latin says, from head to heel, is how they describe it.
I love that. And I mean, that really, it kind of contextualizes it into the types of maladies that would typically have been, I guess, dominant or prominent when you go and see your, I don't know, your physician, your barber. Who did you see?
Well, so that's a whole other thing, because when we stretch this far back in European history, and indeed history in many other places with similar kinds of sophisticated medical regimes, we actually find that the array of people who medieval Europeans would have gone to for healing depended on all sorts of things, maybe not that dissimilarly to today. Probably where they were physically. Did you live in the countryside? Did you live in a city where there might have been more healers than there were in rural areas? How much money you had, just like today in certain parts of the world. America, and many other places. I shouldn't be. I'm just sort of, as we were discussing before, I'm living in America and Rome, and it's really interesting to see how just deeply intertwined, maybe less than my native UK, politics and, well, that's not true at all.
Well, you're here at a very strange well, I shouldn't say this is not atypical, right? But what a time to choose to come to America.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I was about to completely let my native land off the hook and say that we don't intertwine politics and medicine as much. And that's totally not true. They're absolutely intertwined, but just in different ways. And so that's been very interesting.
I mean, there's an extra layer that we are one of the only kind of what you might consider Western societies right now that doesn't have some form of universal healthcare. And so there's all of the implications of that as well.
And what's really interesting to look back into the Middle Ages is that actually, this is not the idea of universal healthcare is often touted, I don't know the American debates as well, but often touted as a kind of newfangled modern conception. In Britain, the narrative often starts with the foundation of the NHS, the National Health Service. But actually, you have the kings of France who set up effectively hospitals, or more like hospices, for the blind to be treated at the king's, aka the nation's, expense. So you do have all sorts of you can get really into the economics of that in the past as well. So simply to say that there's a huge array of different kinds of healers to whom people might have had access to.
Interesting. Yeah. And that's probably also, I mean, it's contingent, like you said, on their financial status. It's probably also very contingent on their geographic location, because I think lots of times when, and maybe this is a personal bias, or maybe this is a little bit more representative of what my fellow American listeners might also, I'm trying to figure out the best way to word this. Like, at first blush, I think if somebody says, medieval, I think medieval Europe. And I go to this, like the cover of the American version of your book, I'm not sure what the UK version looks like, is, a painting of a man and his body part. He's got like his head wrapped and his body parts are like all kind of, I don't know if these are, they've been removed. Like his legs have.
Well, so that's an amazing painting.
Let's talk about this.
So we could talk about that, but then we could also talk about preconceptions, because I think
because this also very much gathers that, like it taps into exactly. It's like white people, and they're like people in robes and angels, and then like a sad poor serf, and it's got that very classic medieval vibe to it.
Yeah. So what I think the publishers in the US liked about this painting is that it does, like you say, pull together lots of preconceptions about the Middle Ages, but it also flips them. So it's a painting that was made right at the end of the 15th century, probably in the 1490s in Spain. It's a big altarpiece. And so it's a man lying recumbent, as you said, in this kind of lush velvet kind of lined bed. And he appears to have one of his kind of both his legs are exposed, and one of them has been chopped off by two kind of figures who are standing with these kind of gorgeous robes and red caps, and they're being attended to by angels, three angels, one of whom holds a candle so it can be seen, the other who holds an old leg, and one of these figures seems to be replacing the leg. So,
yeah, I thought it might be like a wooden leg, but maybe it's like a cadaver leg.
They liked it because it seems to. These are actually two figures of they're two Christian saints, St. Cosmas and St. Damien. They were famous kind of healer saints, very, very popular in Western Europe and also in the Byzantine Empire. So a kind of Greek-speaking empire based around Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, which runs throughout the medieval period into the mid-15th century and then becomes or is kind of taken over by the Ottoman Empire. So these are two saints. They're doing. This just comes from a story of the life of these saints and their miracles. So it's something that you often get. It's kind of hagiographies is the term we use. So these miracle collections and stories that accrue around particular saints that might be shared and that might effectively encourage cults of these saints in different locations, encourage people to address prayers to these saints and things like that. And so this is a story of a miraculous leg transplant that these two figures do. It's sometimes known as the miracle of the transplanted leg. And it seems to kind of really hit home at some of the preconceptions of the Middle Ages that it's done by fantastical Christian kind of saints, that they're angels, that they didn't really know anything about the fact that if you chop someone's leg off, they would almost certainly, die, if not immediately, pretty soon thereafter from complications. Mm-hmm. So what's interesting though is that if this flips that, I would say in a number of ways, or the way I like to write about it is that, for one thing, the leg that is being replaced is not a wooden leg. It's actually the leg of a black man, an African man, as the story tells it, who had died the same day. And the angels were taking what was, a cancerous leg, this man who had prayed to St. Cosmas and Damien, and was replacing it. So it's sort of quite a strange, potentially transgressive biracial transplant. So already, at least in some small way, the painting acknowledges a world beyond just a white Western European world. And certainly when it comes to the Middle Ages and certainly medieval medicine, which is heavily inflected in the Middle Ages through Arabic writings, so writings coming out of the Middle East, North Africa. It's a very multicultural world. So it gestures at that as well as the kind of fantastical nature. But, what's really interesting is that I begin the book talking of preconceptions with an anecdote. I have a friend who was a curator at the Victorian Albert Museum, big, very famous museum in London.
I've been there.
Great. Did you like it?
Yeah, I did. But also I felt like there was a lot of sketchy stuff going on in that museum.
Yeah, I mean, they're museums, right? And museums are problematic places. Actually, in some ways, maybe some of the less problematic, well, I don't know if that's true, but they have a lot of amazing British medieval collections and actually European medieval collections. So objects, again, stretching from, I guess we could say the Middle Ages begins around the year 500. It's not a fixed period, right? It's a kind of a broad strokes term all the way through to 1500. So you've got 1,000 years of history there. They've got some amazing medieval objects, all sorts of things from religious and secular worlds, things from wealthy backgrounds, things which were very kind of humble objects of individuals. And they were redoing how they displayed their objects. And so they asked just your average Joe who went to the museum what were the words that popped into their mind when they were given the term Renaissance and the term medieval. And of course, the responses to the Renaissance were all typically kind of wondrous. I described them as being a little bit like a fancy commercial for a really nice orange juice, right? People were talked about being in Italy, about beautiful white marble everywhere. The sun is shining. Yeah, this is our preconception of the Renaissance.
Gilding. I just think of everything being gilded in the Renaissance.
Oh my God, totally. Yeah. What would you say? What would you say if you were putting yourself into the mind of a British museum goer? Would you think was the response to the Middle Ages then, or to the medieval?
Death, suffering, maybe I always think of medieval kind of I guess, objects. So maybe less so paintings or sculpture, art, but more kind of art in the terms of found objects like clothing and things like that, as like being made of a lot of wood and leather and
Basically,
woolen.
a scene from Game of Thrones. Is that fair to say?
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, I didn't watch Game of Thrones. I'm the literal worst.
Good for you. No, you've saved yourself a lot of time.
I think of like very Tristan and Isolde. Like that's where I go.
Okay.
I think, which is very strange. Yeah.
So the top sort of 5 things that came across were, and I always use this in teaching with my students, were huts, God. And I don't think that's like a nice God. That's a negative God. Smiting, a lot of smiting. Darkness, the Dark Ages is a term that I don't use anymore, and many of my colleagues don't use anymore because it's got such obvious pejorative associations and negative associations. Hut. Mud was the 4th one. So huts, God, darkness, mud, and the 5th one was potatoes.
Interesting. Like that's all anybody ate?
Well, exactly. And of course, if you know anything about the history of vegetables, of tubers, you will know that potatoes were only reliably grown in Europe after they were imported there from the Americas. So not until after the Middle Ages finished. So, people have this preconception that is that's kind of, significant enough. And I think it's got through popular culture. In the UK, the Gothic revival and kind of Victorian obsession with the Middle Ages was a very particular kind of Middle Ages. They were thinking about, again, knights, Tristan and Isolde, exactly those kind of things you were talking about. But it's significant enough a preconception to warp their understanding of like fundamental like placement of things, of the fact that, that they've created a world in which a vegetable that didn't exist was the only thing that people ate. So really what I'm trying to do in the book, and what I think, to come back to the picture, I was hoping at least to do, is you kind of pull people in with this beautiful, extremely sophisticated painting, really amazingly rendered, punchy, bright, colourful, totally not the Dark Ages. But also something interesting is going on there. There's medical conceptions that are being subverted with and kind of clashed together with religious conceptions, with geography, with race, with all sorts of things. So hopefully there's more that can be pulled out of it.
And I think that that's really one of the things that struck me, even just looking at not just how your book is organized, but like I mentioned, the sort of geographic spread of what we know about this long period. I mean, I think a lot of times we think of Europe in the 14 and 1500s as being the Middle Ages. But of course, the world was, functioning. This is modern history all over the world, and there is something to be said about areas outside of Europe, and also the year 500 was very different from the year 1500.
Absolutely. I mean, think about that word, the Middle Ages, right? It's a kind of term that defines itself by other things, by the end of one thing and the beginning of another thing. So effectively the classical world in European culture and its rebirth in the Renaissance, literally rebirth. So one of the ways that I think one of the things I try and do, exactly as you say, is in the book, is to think as broadly as I can within my worlds of expertise. So I work mainly on Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. So I think a little bit about really all of the different cultures that were inherited, or it had various inheritances, especially medical inheritances, from what was the Roman Empire, which spanned that large, or much of that large swathe of geographical region. So we think a bit, and I talk and teach a little bit about work made in Arabic or Muslim cultures, especially around in the Middle East, Jews and Jewish culture, which kind of really do pervade all those geographical areas, and Christian culture, mainly based again in kind of Europe, and I think mainly about Western Europe as well. A lot France, Britain, Italy, Spain, Bohemia, so modern day Poland, Germany, places like that. So obviously there's way more than that in this moment, and there are historians who work really interestingly on what's happening in Central America at that time, or what's happening in the kingdoms of West Africa at this point, or in Japan or China or anywhere around the world. But I think that's what bound things together for me. Is that's what makes the stereotype that this is just sort of the Roman Empire ended, and then there was just all these peasants knocking each other on the head with clubs, and then suddenly we got the Renaissance. And actually, so I took that idea of the fall of the Roman Empire as my cue to start sort of or inviting people to think slightly differently about what actually happened after that moment.
Right. And I mean, I think one of the things that you just mentioned, which I don't want to gloss over, is you were talking about the many different cultures that kind of made up this post-Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned them, kind of contextualize them in terms of their religious faith, because it's really inextricably linked, isn't it? Culture and religion, and even a way of thinking about the world, maybe what we might consider pre-modern science. You really couldn't tease religion out of it, could you?
Well, it's tough, I think you can and you can't, which is such a historian's answer. But let me say why. Let me tell you why I say that. So, on the one hand, it's clear that large parts of European, Middle Eastern, North African culture were extremely focused and organized around religion. So let's just take Western Europe. Let's take somewhere like France, for example. The kings of France are considered gods, effectively gods, rulers on earth. They are Christian rulers. Their culture is totally enshrined in imbricated with Christian culture. To step aside and think about medicine, so we might have university physicians who themselves are based in say, like universities in Paris or Montpellier, two big universities that emerge, especially by the 13th century, as being really powerhouses of thinking about academic medicine. Those are effectively Christian institutions. They're largely the biggest departments within these universities are departments of theology and law, so effectively and religious law. So, and canon law, as we would call it, canon law.
Okay.
So medicine is kind of part of that, but these are religious settings, and really settings only for wealthy men as well. They're hugely, they do not represent the whole swathe of society. That said, take something like surgery. Now, surgeons are quite distinct from physicians in the Middle Ages. They for various complicated cultural reasons, grow up in, especially in somewhere like France, in quite separate worlds. A surgeon who you might go and see probably only dealt, by the way, with the surface of your body. It boils, sewing up wounds, things like that. We're not talking about like deep invasive surgery, which was known very well at the time to be fatal. The reason that these saints on the front cover are doing an amputation is because it was known that an amputation is not something really that can be successfully pulled off in this moment, or not without serious trouble. So it's
right. It is miraculous that they would have been able to do it and the person would survive.
Exactly. So rather than thinking of it as an ignorance, they just think you chop off your foot. They know you can't do that, which is why saints have to do it. So surgeons, again, let's take Paris as an example, probably or almost certainly would have been trained not in a kind of university academic environment that we think of, but much more in as craft-based settings. So in workshops, there would be guilds, much like the training of metal workers or painters, in fact. And often painters and surgeons sometimes share guilds, especially in Italy, that happens. So they might not necessarily be able to read and write, but it's a craft that's learned through apprenticeship. It's, think of the word surgery, right? It's etymology from the Greek, kairos, ergos, hand and work, handiwork. It's literally hands-on medicine. So that's taken very literally in a medieval sense. And so they're quite separate. Someone like that might believe in God, might not believe in God. We don't really know very much about people like that because many of them don't leave behind grand kind of diaries or big surgical treatises. And indeed...
Right. So you're talking about the practitioners themselves.
Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
I think the same rule probably stands for many of the patients. So a good way that colleagues often use to talk about religion in the Middle Ages is to think of it almost a bit like we think of gravity today. That is to say, it's like a dominant structure that pretty much everyone understands, orders our world, but you and I don't go around patting each other on the back going, isn't gravity a great thing? Like, isn't it wonderful that we didn't fly off the face of the earth today? It's just a kind of underlying, ingrained fundamental. And I think when you start to think about it like that, it's not necessarily something that is on the forefront of people's minds, does not govern every single thing that they do in the world, but perhaps, and clearly, right, this is a world that acknowledges multiple religions. So Jews live often persecuted alongside Christians. You have large periods of really interesting interfaith mercantile activities, so traders moving across large parts of the world. Likewise, religious war. So people know that there are other people who believe in other gods. So do you see what I mean? It's clearly a dominant cultural force, but I wouldn't say it's the only cultural force. And medicine responds accordingly.
Yeah. And so if we were to kind of come up with some of the, oftentimes I think even in modern society, when we see ideological differences, you're right, religion is a big and an important part of those kinds of differences. But also, I think we often will talk about things being geopolitical in nature, I think it's funny because, again, the preconceived notion is that the, Middle Ages were dark in the sense that there was a lot of religious oppression. I think that that's kind of where a lot of people's heads go because they think of things like the Inquisition.
Yeah, or the Crusades, right? So
or the Crusades, yeah, exactly.
Religious war, sure, yeah. It's maybe this is an interesting time also to bring in objects, because it's also about, it's what art historians call accidents of survival. That's not to say that things survive by accident, but rather the opposite, that it's no accident these certain types of things survived. So the reason that you have, especially say in Italy, just to pick up one example of many amazing examples of, you still have a lot of Catholic churches crammed with amazing medieval objects associated with the church and with religion. It is because those cultural forces were so dominant, culturally and financially, and that they have been maintained in many ways through to the present day. Likewise, expensive objects, say expensive illuminated manuscripts. So these aren't books as we think of them today. These aren't printed on paper. That begins in Europe in sort of around 1450, in the mid 15th century. Until then, what we think of as books, codices, or sometimes long scrolls, are made on animal skin. So it's treated animal parchment, which is then written on with a scribe using inks that they have made themselves. It's a huge undertaking and a very expensive thing, a medieval book. So the fact that several the medieval books have survived have done so because they were such prized objects.
And they're gorgeous. I mean, I remember seeing when I visited Cambridge, I think last year, underneath in a library, they had the display cases and there's like a red piece of fabric to protect them from the sun. And just the colors. And again, everything's handwritten. It's handwritten absolutely beautifully. And then there's so many plates, like so many artistic pieces and like gilded little pieces and bright reds and golds. And I was pretty amazed by how stunning these works of arts were.
Yeah, they really are exquisite. And I mean, just to think about the time taken on something like that. Okay, so say you have a manuscript, which we have many, which is, 500 pages long, right? That each one of those is potentially either a full or a half skin of, in most cases, often a lamb, right? So that's 250 lambs. So that's potentially many seasons worth of lambs that have to be taken, they're skinned, then the parchment treated. And that's just to make the stuff upon which we might, the scribe or the illuminator would then write and paint and gild. As you say, there's a lot of gold often involved as well. Yeah. So these are big investments. And so it's often for that reason that they survive. And so to think back to our preconceptions around the prominence of religion, kings and queens, things like that, it's because those are the patrons of the more expensive and long-lasting and prized objects, things that are passed from generation to generation. So what we have in the material record is quite skewed. Now, in terms of medical history, we do also have other things. We have really interesting work being done by archaeologists in what we could call paleogenetics. So the historical genetics, where we might be able to look at bodies that are literally getting actual medieval bodies, where you could do all sorts of different kinds of analysis on the bones of these individuals to find out various things about them with different degrees of certainty, even to some extent. If you find the right bit of some of the hard encased bone in the teeth, or kind of up around the jaw in the head, scientists have been able to extract what we call aDNA, ancient DNA, or HDNA, historical DNA. And so you can effectively sequence the DNA of an individual and find out all sorts of things about them. Maybe from their bones, you might be able to find out about their diet. You might be able to find out the color of their hair. You might be able to find various genetic diseases that they had. So we're having to, I think, expand, and for the last 50 years have been really trying to expand the ways in which we approach medieval evidence as not just that of kings and queens and bishops, so that we can expand the stories that we tell about the medieval past to include ordinary people from different kinds of backgrounds as well.
Right. And unfortunately, people who, although there may have been a personal record, there wouldn't have been prioritization in preserving these kinds of things simply because of the power dynamic of the time. I mean, and this is bigger than, the medieval period. This speaks to all of human history, right? Like history is written by the people in power. And so we now obviously know that means that history is wildly biased, at least the types of history that we often read in our school books. What about actual artifacts as well? I mean, especially with regards to, medieval bodies, with regards to medieval medicine, tools, tools of the trade these things fascinate me. I love going to, the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia and, places where I can. Totally. And I mean, that's, I think, why I was drawn to wanting to talk about your book as well, is there's a kind of weird voyeuristic, there's sort of a schadenfreude, I'm so glad I'm not having my bloodlet in modern society. So is that something that you've drawn into your work? Is this study of the kinds of what we often now think of as more barbaric tools that were used?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, I would pick you up on the word barbaric, because that's partly because we see a giant saw and we think, oh my God, but probably if you saw an amputation saw that's used today, you would still think, oh my God, that's not a very nice thing to do.
Oh yeah, that's not polite society. We just don't show those off.
Exactly, right? Yeah. So I would say that the survival, again, is mixed and depends on circumstance and often, as we were saying, the kind of social and cultural fallout of power. So some of the things that survive pretty well are medical manuscripts, which would have survived often in often in a university setting. Sometimes towards the end of the Middle Ages, you might find some personal notebooks of physicians who would list certain things within them. But that tells us a huge amount about treatments, cure, the theory of medicine, which was very different to how we theorize the medicine and the body today. So books and books in that form are really a key resource. We have some tools that survive, especially from the end of the period. And I write a little bit in the book about some amazing examples of some 15th century extremely ornate surgical saws, which do survive. And these are very strange objects, which seem, what's really interesting is that I think you have to, on the one hand, we go very quickly to a kind of empirical understanding of medicine. We think about science as being about data, about facts, and we look at let's to paint a picture, a bit of a surgical saw which has a blade in it, and the blade is held at either side with two kind of quite ornate, monstrous mouths, gilded in gold, that are kind of biting onto the saw. And you think, God, that must have been completely unsanitary, unhelpful. Why on earth might that be there? But I think we have to think, especially when we delve further back into the history of medicine, about other roles that maybe things like a tool might be playing than simply doing the job. So, for instance, one of the first things that you would do if a surgeon was struck off, if you were told that you could not practice by your guild, is your tools were removed. Tools are kind of a really important social marker. And I think a lot of people thought about tools or manuscripts with beautiful illuminations, which tell you a little bit of information about medicine. But why on earth do you need this? This thing that tells you basically, 20 points about the body, but it's rendered as this amazing, beautiful illustration of a figure, richly annotated. And you think, well, why on earth? That's not very practical. Again, we have to think about the roles that maybe these objects are playing in a more social sense. So are some of these things maybe a little bit like, a surgical white coat, right? That when someone comes in wearing a white coat, or you go to a doctor's office and the furniture is beautiful, and they've got their things they've got their stuff on the wall, their kind of diplomas. Maybe actually things like tools or books play into a doctor-patient relationship in a slightly different way. That maybe what they're doing is, someone says, actually, I've got a problem with I've got a headache. And the doctor goes, oh, okay, I'll do some bloodletting on you. And the doctor knows exactly how they would do that. It's a very simple procedure. But maybe in going over to the grand book, opening up the expensive pages, yes, I see, we'll do this and we'll do this, maybe reassures the patient. Maybe it tells the patient that this person's successful because they got paid by their previous clients. Actually, one of the main places we have a lot of evidence for surgeons, again, who aren't so much in that literate world of medicine, especially in the earlier Middle Ages, is in legal proceedings where they're being sued for malpractice.
Oh, no way. It goes all the way back.
Oh, yeah. And one of the, when you look at surgical treatises which begin to be written towards the end, there are all sorts of things that surgeons are being told. Is don't take on a patient when you know basically they're in too bad a state, because you'll get blamed for it. So there's lots of this. Likewise, they say, don't show the patient the tools that you're going to use, to come back to tools, because it might freak them out. So all of this stuff, which we presume was them being stupid or naive or actually, it's very carefully constructed and crafted and full of kind of knowledge in its practice.
Is it safe to assume, too, that there was a certain amount of breadth, A, depending on the geographic or maybe the cultural, social implications, B, depending on the time period, in terms of, like you mentioned, a tool that might be, really heavily gilded or carved and have all of these ornate aspects to it. And you mentioned, like, we would say that's quite impractical, but maybe to a client, to a patient, or even to other physicians at the time or practitioners, it's a status symbol. But also, would there have been, going back to maybe religion, or maybe a better way to put it is spirituality, this idea that these things are also imbued with some sense of kind of magic? Like, how much did supernatural or magical thinking sort of tie itself into the practice of the day?
That's a really good question, and it's kind of a hard one to answer. In to say people thought X or Y, because, as you said, it's very broad. But again, let's just say take just because it's the example that I know the best, Christian Europe as a particular example. So I think, the relationship between magic and technology is a fascinating one for historians, right? One man's technology is another person's magic. What distinguishes those things in different moments, in different eras, is often a very fine line, and a culturally drawn line. What I will say is that all of the big three faiths of the Middle Ages in Europe, so Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, all have built within them a strong link between spiritual health and physical health. That's just kind of a fundamental link. And that somehow the inside and the surface of the body is reflecting someone's inner morality, spirituality, and their kind of spiritual authenticity. So I think we have to be quite frank when we look back and say that a lot of what we think of as medieval medicine, although it was extremely sophisticated, had its own dense theories, huge academic texts written about it, multiple kinds of practitioners, much of it was probably not necessarily very efficacious on on a modern level.
Right.
And in that sense, I think that what that does is it opens up other kinds of avenues for, like you say, spiritual healing, folk healing. For instance, that's another reason to come back to the image of the healing saints that are on the cover of the book. Traveling somewhere to a shrine in all three major faiths was something that was often done to inspire good health in a particular individual. You might go on a pilgrimage, so we have some amazing documents of people from Britain going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In order to see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in much the same way that people go on pilgrimage there today, and would perhaps leave offerings. We have all sorts of amazing votive objects, is what these offerings that were left at shrines were called. And this is a practice that way predates Christianity, by the way, all of these religions, in fact, likely. So you might leave, for instance, one of the practices that was done a lot in certain shrines in northern France is that you would leave a candle that was of the same physical weight as the part of your body or as your entire body that needed healing. So there's a kind of sense that you're leaving something of your physical body behind the site of this shrine. And you have to remember what a shrine is, right? In Christianity especially, a shrine is the site of a saint's bones. A saint is someone who's been so holy that they've circumnavigated the Last Judgment, and their kind of holiness on earth means that their soul is already in heaven. So there's this sort of like spiritual antenna running in this medieval theological sense between the saint who's in heaven, who's right next to God and has all these kind of wonderful healing potential of the miracle, and their body, which is on earth. And so by touching the body, by leaving gifts and objects of the body, you might in some way sort of have that direct spiritual line, and it might cause some kind of miraculous cure. And indeed, to come back to what we were saying before, written into the narratives of all of these saints is that they are miraculous. I don't know that much about what happened, the process of becoming a saint today, but you need to have a bunch of miracles recorded in your name in order to become a saint in the Christian church, for people to become a kind of sainted today. So
there really is this, like, it's almost like a weird, what we think of now, because of course we have the gift of hindsight, and we have the gift of like what we think of as like modern, the modern scientific method. But there almost is this like evidence-based kind of pseudo scientific spiritual conception around these types of practices. Like there's something tangible to them that at the time probably felt very modern and very powerful from, I guess, a scientific perspective.
Yeah, certainly evidence-based, right?
Right.
So you get amazing, this is where objects come into play. So think about, an arm reliquary, which we have at several different shrines in Western Europe. So it's the, not necessarily doesn't contain the arm bone, but it might contain a bunch of bones of a saint wrapped in, and kind of placed inside perhaps a kind of a rock crystal holder that's then itself covered in gilded silver, so kind of gold and silver in the shape of a hand, right? Often with a pointing finger. So this is something that could be literally wielded by perhaps a bishop during rituals in order to give some kind of blessing. But these objects and these kind of actual bits of bone sometimes were contested. To come back to your evidence-based point, there were two different monasteries in Britain who claimed to have a true relic of a particular saint. And, a commission is sent by the ecclesiastical authorities to go and interview people who had miracles at both, and one was deemed to be true miracles and the true relic, and other was deemed not to be. And that had all sorts of quite complicated cultural and financial implications, because all sorts of people would flock to the real one and leave donations right at the real one and not at the other. That's not to say that it's done for kind of nefarious reasons, that people didn't genuinely believe it, but there were implications to having a real relic that you could kind of show off within a religious community. So definitely evidence-based in that sense. But I would also
say... And of course, there's implications to power as well, of like being the keepers of something that,
absolutely, the custodians.
Had social power. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I'm curious what you think, though. I mean, I don't know how far we are that, we again look back on thinking about healing miracles and superstition as being quite a backwards practice in a very secularized modern world. But there are still huge numbers of people, especially when we think globally, but even within, to take the example of the United States, for whom prayer is considered an extremely significant, efficacious, spiritual, medical device in some way. I mean, maybe that's a minority now.
Well, no, not in the U.S. I don't think it's a minority. I think the issue is, who is authoring this kind of idea, right? So it's obviously not accepted in mainstream medicine, that prayer, and there's actually kind of sadly continue to be funded efforts to try and look at intercessory prayer and things like that, even though it's like, highly debunked. Whether or not it has some sort of efficacy for one person's sense of wellness or psychology is a completely different conversation. Okay, yeah. And I think
so we've got really medical efficacy, we've got psychology, and we've got a spectrum, right? So that's prayer. But what if we were to talk about acupuncture, right? Something that probably a century ago in the West, people would have been like, who, what now? What on earth are you doing? That's crazy. But which, again, is being brought increasingly into the fold of, in maybe a slightly patronizing way, a practice that's been going for centuries, for millennia, and been shown to be, is now being kind of brought into the fold of kind of medicine. I mean, what's really interesting, I think we can't exclude ourselves from the general dictum that medicine is a cultural thing. At the moment, our medicine puts huge cultural emphasis on scientific efficacy, randomized control trials, evidence-based medicine. But that is a cultural decision that we've made. It does not mean that is how our medicine can always be forever. And it certainly doesn't mean that we should judge medicine of the past because it doesn't take the same standards. That's probably my bottom line.
And that's the point. I think that's an important point to make, is that we're looking at it through a lens that literally might not have even existed at the time. And so, or at least that lens was a very different version. There was not a randomized controlled trial. Like, it didn't exist. And so the idea that we would look at things through that lens, it's like, again, I said we have the sort of benefit of hindsight. And you're right. I do think that there will be cultural shifts. Personally, though, as kind of a scientific skeptic, and I'm probably showing my bias, but also I think I'm showing the dominant academic bias, is that evidence-based medicine is probably always going to be the gold standard. I don't think that we will go back to a time where we throw evidence out the window. But that said, in psychology, at least, one of the things that we often do is we have a conversation about the medical model in psychology versus a more contextual model, which is one that shows that there are non-specific effects that are beneficial. If somebody sees a doctor, they often are going to feel better. And whether you want to call that a placebo effect, which is a complicated issue, or just a non-specific effect, literally the benefit that comes from another human being putting their hands on you, from another human being who has some form of power or some form of authority telling you something that gives you peace of mind. I mean, these kinds of effects can't be underestimated. And so I think that it's probably not uncommon that people who sought medical treatment for maybe issues of the psyche, or maybe issues that were mild, that probably would have resolve themselves just through immune responses, felt like the visit to the practitioner was what healed them, because it did, in essence.
And also, this is so interesting hearing you talk about that, because it has so many really interesting parallels. It's not just about, I guess, what we think are. It's also about the goals of what we expect medicine to be able to do. So some of the earliest hospitals that are built during the Middle Ages, initially in the Middle East and in the Islamic world, and increasingly with a slightly different cultural composition in the European West, again, just thinking about my area of expertise, these are often religious institutions, and really they're what we would think of today as hospices. They're places for those for whom this is sort of palliative, often end-of-life care or long-term care for infirm and disabled individuals. And they also have a sort of sideline in care and treatment for those who cannot afford it within certain communities, so a sort of charitable element of it. But, there's not necessarily an expectation that we quite impudently have, I think, in the modern world today, that medicine will be able to heal us. You don't have that in the Middle Ages. There's a sense, I think, and that keys back into the spirituality that we were talking about earlier, that maybe that decision is not society's to be able to make. And so you have many different medical practices from various different types of early medieval pain relief through to a situation like a hospital, a medieval hospital, which again was probably more like a hospice, where you're not there, people aren't there specifically to be cured, but to be cared for. So there's a distinction there in outcome as well as process.
And there must also have been quite a lot of crossover between what we would now define as mental illness and some sort of like biological infirmary, which of course we know even now the boundaries are not clean. But of course, when the causative theories about why somebody might have, quote, hysteria or neurosis or exhaustion or, all of the different categories that were defined at the time, probably were in many ways inextricable from, bad blood, like different, unbalanced humors and things of that nature.
Yeah, there's the history of mental illness in the Middle Ages is really interesting. In the 15th century, there's a hospital that's founded by the king of Spain. I believe it's Aragon, but I can't remember which part of Spain, sorry. But it's in Valencia, and it's the first hospital in Europe which it sort of specializes, if we can call it that, and that's already giving it too modern a term, but which offers treatment for people who are understood to have mental illness. And that shows a kind of emerging understanding of the mind as a space of cure, but it's not something that's really very well understood, in part because the brain is really poorly understood in the Middle Ages. But the brain's a great one. I mean, you were talking about paradigms of medicine. Okay, I too find it difficult to believe, probably just as someone in the 14th century found it difficult to believe that the body wasn't constituted of the four humours that circulated inside the body. You and I find it difficult to believe that evidence-based medicine in that sense is going to shift or change, but we might very conceivably in the not too distant future find something that we completely did not previously know about the brain, which has all sorts of specific impacts on treatments, not just associated with the brain, but with mental health, with frankly anything. So there's the possibility of that paradigm shift, I think, around the corner.
Or like even with kind of genetic or customized medicine, like we could look back and say, oh, we just broad netted everybody. We treated them all the same without just looking at their DNA first. So, and I think that we're starting to see that shift, at least in oncology. And you're right. Once we have tools, which there's no reason to really think that it's impossible, just that it's a bridge that we haven't yet crossed to diagnose mental illness or kind of biochemical illnesses at that level, at the neurotransmitter level, which we can't do now. Like when it comes to treating depression, anxiety, whatever, oftentimes it's like, these are your symptoms. Okay, these are treatments that we know work on those symptoms. Let's try and see what fits. Because I can't just measure your dopamine or your serotonin and then give you a calibrated treatment. But maybe in the future we can do things like that. It's one thing that I think sticks out to me as kind of a scientific skeptic is some of the mythology that we carry around things like, I'm thinking of the Marquis de Sade, and I'm thinking of these like, asylums or these hospitals where people were like in agony, and there were treatments that we often, like you said, these words that we throw around like barbaric, or where the treatment is worse than the disease. And one of the things that I think really cuts through and symbolizes that for me is the myth of the Iron Maiden. And I think it's such a beautiful example of like, I've gathered that most people don't know that the Iron Maiden as a device is anachronistic. Like, it didn't exist. Like, we actually put it into museums after the fact to say, look at this weird medieval thing, but it never was around during the Middle Ages.
No, absolutely. And that brings us almost full circle back to the potato, right?
Right,
The person who
yes.
described the Middle Ages as having potatoes. There's a whole brand of medievalists who think about those preconceptions and where they come from. Super interesting popular culture, in the UK, especially back to Victorian Gothic culture, and that kind of Gothic novel, and the kind of reimagining of medieval culture. But, reflecting on the Middle Ages and why it is the Middle Ages goes all the way back to the Middle Ages itself, right? It's Petrarch, it's an Italian writer Petrarch in the 13th century who writes, he effectively, or one of the, we're not sure if it's him, but we think he coined the phrase the Middle Ages. He says, actually, I hope people are, I hope that there will be kind of great illumination in the time to come, because he's in the kind of very beginning, the birth of this humanist culture. That's especially growing up in Italy in that moment. I said 13th century, I meant the 1300s. So he's kind of writing in the middle of the kind of 1340s, 50s, 60s, around them. And he says, I see this great flowering, and I see a kind of brightness coming on the horizon that was like the brightness of the ancient world, and that I hope people will kind of look not too kind of harshly on the dark ages in between. So even people during what we think of as the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, are themselves thinking about these conceptualizations of history and periodization and stereotyping and caricaturing as to kind of negative and positive. And I don't know, I often try and think about what would be a good comparison. I imagine talking to kids who have never grown up. This is probably the case with all of my students now, actually. They're starting if they're 18 years old. They've not grown up in a world without the internet.
Right.
We can be very nostalgic for a kind of pre-digital past, but we can also acknowledge that all sorts of things were a lot harder. So we have all these, I'm kind of going in a slight circle here, but we have all of these different conceptualizations of the past, both the near past and the distant past. And for me, I think all we have to do is have a degree of sympathy. So we're looking back to the year 1500 or the year 1400 through 500 or 600 years of history. And I think we have to view it with as much sympathy as we would like to be viewed in 500 or 600 years' time, be that in our art, our medicine, our knowledge, just any aspect of our lives.
And that kind of, I think, brings me back to one of the first things that I wanted to touch on with you thematically, is this idea that somehow people 500 years ago or even 1,000 years ago were less than, were a different species, were savage, were barbaric. Obviously, these types of stereotypes and preconceived notions have notoriously driven things like colonialism, racism, deep interpersonal conflict, genocide, human atrocity. And I think that we tend to do the same thing when we look back historically, that we forget that like Homo sapiens these were the same people as we are. They just had different knowledge. That's the only difference. Their brains were the same. Their bodies were the same. Like, modern humans are modern humans genetically, biologically. The difference is culture. It's really the only difference that we've all had, depending on where we lived or when we lived.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think that's something that is fully appreciated by many people, that the actual physical components or even the capabilities, the mental capabilities, are the exact same, no matter who you are, no matter where you are on the planet, no matter when you were.
And I hope what that, thinking about that, what that will encourage people to reflect upon is where they get their history from. So what is the, really, if you take all of those words that I used at the beginning to describe the Middle Ages, right? Huts, mud, darkness, potatoes, and so on, they're all things that modernity explicitly places itself against, right? We're in a secular humanist kind of world, a scientific world. We're an enlightened rather than dark in the dark ages.
Yeah, I mean, there's major value judgment there, right? We are better, we are smarter, we are whatever. There's always we are in a better place than we were.
And so in a way, a kind of denigrating of the past is natural, is a kind of natural offshoot of any kind of historical progress. We probably as a species really need to think, hopefully, that we are dealing with the coronavirus better than Western Europe dealt with the second kind of great plague of the so-called Black Death in 1347 through to 1356 or whatever it was.
Right, because we're washing our hands.
Because we know things like, we have things like germ theory on our side. But look at the structural inequalities that are now being exposed in the way that all sorts of nations, developed and undeveloped, are dealing with this. And say, to take the United States as an example, or the UK, the massively different ways in which different cultural communities are being impacted by this. We are perhaps, we might have hand washing, but we still have other kinds of structural inequality and difficulties that were just the same as in the mid 14th century, when a wealthy Tuscan could flee out to their villa in the countryside and try and sit something out, but someone who had to, a medieval key worker, so to speak, couldn't have the same kind of luxury.
Absolutely.
So maybe the differences aren't so stark.
Yeah, these social, cultural, and like you said, structural inequities, really, I think you could draw massive parallels. You could go back so far in time and point to places where we're like, how have we not, quote, progressed? But then when we talk about progress in other contexts, I think sometimes we are very much biased towards technology. Like, more, quote, sophisticated is always, quote, better. But what we don't think about is the fact that, like, the human population in medieval times was so much smaller. The impact on the planet was so much less. And
the food that the medieval people ate didn't have chemicals. They were still, well into the 16th century, there were salmon swimming up the River Thames. If you go to London now, you look inside, all you see is a couple of barges floating around collecting rubbish in some murky black water. It's not, not a pleasant thing. So
right. So how we define progress too is something that we're always kind of reinventing with more, it's like, I don't know. One of the things I always want to think about is kind of like, especially within the scientific skeptic community, because I think sometimes we have this deep bias that, like, technology, science, progress, it's all tied up with almost like capitalism, as opposed to tying it up with social justice. And when we start to look at it through like a social justice, environmental justice lens, we realize that sometimes you can't have it both ways, or we haven't been pre-planning to have it both ways. And so the implications of sort of unconstrained economic prosperity for the richest of the rich or for the strongest of the strong actually has implications that are obviously horrific for the planet and horrific for disenfranchised people. So, really, how are we better off? Yeah, of course, our lifespan is longer. And of course, infant mortality is lower. But at the same time, we've reached and are exceeding the carrying capacity of the planet. So these kinds of conversations are important to have. They're hard truths, I think. And history is a big part of that equation. Without studying history, we are, in the dark.
it's really interesting as you talk, I'm just thinking of all the ways in which all of those things you're mentioning are rippling back slowly into the past as,
Right.
I guess, historians of the Middle Ages are now, as our own world expands in those different kinds of categories, people are making all sorts of really fascinating new discoveries about the past. People are really putting a serious and sustained focus on, say, the relationship, just to take a tiny part of the kind of academic world that I'm part of, people who are taking a serious and sustained look at how the European cultures of the Middle Ages interacted with all sorts of other cultures in Africa, in the Middle East, in East Asia. At the moment, I'm working on a project about a Jewish traveler who traveled from his native Spain all the way east to Basra and to the to Yemen, to the and up through the Nile and back. These are individuals who we're informed with those new kinds of questions that are being asked about our own society. I think there's a generation of historians who are now charging into the kind of the material of the past with new questions. And I would say medicine is actually, the history of medicine and the history of medieval medicine is something that's being hugely enlarged by these understandings, and by this new way of thinking about and kind of viewing the world. Whose histories are we searching out here?
Yes. And what is that context? I mean, I think it really speaks to, I recently had Gaia Vince on the show, and one of the big kind of takeaways from her newest book is that this idea of like human evolution. So we're talking about early human history. As humans evolved, what we typically like to think of as genetically or biologically, we cannot separate that from their cultural and their kinship evolution. That society and culture are such a part of growth and change that we, if we try to look at any of these historical artifacts in some sort of vacuum or through even a contemporary lens, we're missing the sort of, and this, I think, has been the downfall of Western anthropology. So much of Western anthropology has looked at indigenous cultures through the lens of Western civilization and tried to just compare and contrast. How is it more primitive? How is it worse than? Instead of saying, let's actually look at it through the eyes of the people who lived it.
And connecting with colleagues in anthropology and archaeology, I think, is not something that necessarily, and likewise vice versa, that people in those disciplines connecting with art historians, people who know about objects and processes of making, is something that's happening more and more, this kind of interdisciplinarity. So my department in the University of East Anglia in Norwich in the UK is a department of art history and world art studies. So we have art historians on our staff, but also anthropologists, also archaeologists, until recently an Egyptologist. And there are many associated staff members in the Sainsbury Research Institute, which is another research institute in our university, who work on art from Africa, from the Americas, from Micronesia and other places. So it's about I think we've got to be a little more humble about what we do and don't know, right? I mean, this is maybe the take home for everything that we should all be doing in this world at the moment. But it's about kind of conversations, shared expertise. And I hope, I'm sure the history of medicine is going to be a really important part of that. And I'm sure lots of historians of medicine who I know would love to speak more to historians, anthropologists, geneticists, and to be, for their work to kind of be reflected in anthropology and genetics and in all sorts of other things as well. It's a bit of a pet peeve. I think maybe this is something that your audience might or might not be familiar with, but take a big medical journal like The Lancet, you'll often have the odd little bit of medical history kind of wrapped up and published there. And the kind of people who will be reviewing that work for publication won't often be historians of medicine, which is a real shame, because this is what you're doing is you're writing medical history potentially to a very large audience of practitioners who might well find some resonance of the history of medicine particularly useful in their practice. And so we should be getting this right. This is how myths perpetuate about bad practices in the past and how the past is stupid and the present is amazing. Actually, what we need to be doing is making sure at every stage we're consulting with specialists and colleagues outside of medicine as well as inside of medicine, so into the humanities as well.
I think even to add to that, an extra layer that those experts themselves oftentimes, not just historically, but even absolutely contemporarily, are not reflective of depth and breadth of knowledge, because those experts tend to be white men. And so I think that we're seeing a shift of understanding that when you have people, and it's not about, I always have to respond to these kinds of ridiculous emails. It's not about women are better or people of color are better. It's that women are not inferior and people of color are not inferior, that there are equivalent offerings. And the more diverse the group of people that are doing the work, the more you're going to have a diverse view of what did happen and what is actively happening. And this is why it's so important to have Indigenous, voices in the room, and to have voices in the room that didn't always have power. Because I think when we look at history, whether we're talking about medical history or political history or, any form of history, as we said at the beginning, it's often written by the people who had the resources to write it and who had the power to make sure that the narrative and the mythology served whatever their purposes were. And so to forget that and to continue to perpetuate that problem, I think shows right there that the, quote, sophistication of modern society is in many ways not that much more sophisticated, at least when it comes to this one kind of parameter.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Jack, so many cool topics, so many things that we were able to touch on, but of course, basically the entire book we didn't talk about. So I think it is also right.
That's why the book's there.
That's why the book's there. That's what I love about the podcast. And the last thing I want to do is summarize the book in the podcast.
Well, I would also say, especially in this kind of lockdown limbo that we're in, one thing that's amazing is that so many museums and galleries who have amazing medieval material, but also collections from the history of medicine, places like the Mutter Museum, all of the Smithsonian Institution museums, things like that, have amazing online resources. So if any of your listeners are, just Google British Library illuminated manuscripts, you'll have these fully digitized, amazing quality images, which are not the same as, cracking open a crusty book and smelling the parchment as it wafts off the page, but you get to see the you can leaf through amazing objects from the Middle Ages, amazing objects from the history of medicine, from, crazy tools that we've been talking about to much more sophisticated and interesting things in other areas. And I really encourage people to have a Google, check it out.
Right. And you realize that we mere mortals don't get to crack open the crusty book and smell it. The way that's a privilege you have as a historian.
That is not true. That is not true.
Where can we touch the books?
Where can we touch the books?
Tell me, where can I touch a book?
I mean, any... if you would go to, certainly I'm best known, I know this best in a British context, but the British Library, for instance, is a national collection. You just book a seat in the manuscripts reading room after you've got your little pass at the front desk, which shows your ID, and you can sit down as the most fragile manuscripts, the most glorious ones are in display cases, perhaps, but thousands of them are out there for people to have a look at. University libraries near you in the US will all have things which I'm sure people can find ways of accessing. Likewise, museums. We're sitting here in California. Think about the amazing collections of the Huntington Library, for instance, or the Getty just up the road. Contact the curators at these things, and often, for instance, in the Huntington, there is a designated reading room where you can become, if you show credentials, you can become a reader, and you can look at this historical material. curators and librarians are desperate to care for their objects, but they all know that they're doing so that people can look at them and engage
Right,
with
that's the
them.
whole point.
So
ultimately.
don't see those people as fierce gatekeepers. I mean, sometimes they have to be, and quite rightly so. But a lot of the time, they would love to, someone to go in your local museum and say, can I come and have a look at this? Or is there a reading room in your museum that I can sit down and have a look at that and see what you have? And you would be surprised at the kind of true treasures that you can just leaf through, not too easily, or online.
And I would love to be a fly on the wall and see how many people just sit there and smell the books.
You got it. You can't help but smell them. They're not kind of. There's a historian called Michael Camille who wrote in the 90s and early 2000s about sensory interaction with manuscripts. There's been a so-called tactile turn and sensory turn, as humanities scholars like to call it, in especially thinking about artworks generally, but especially medieval art. People write a lot about the smell of manuscripts, the touch of manuscripts. These parchment. You can tell often just from holding it which side is the hair side of the skin and which side was the skin side of the skin, so to speak. So sometimes if you lightly brush your hand across it, you can get this little roughness which gives you a sense of the hairs. And there's a section in the book in the chapter on skin which talks about parchment. And sometimes you'll find little holes in books because that's where the animal had a little hole in it. Might have got a thorn in its hide and had a little cut there. So these things echo through as well. Anyway, I could go on about manuscripts all day.
Right. I even have a previous guest on the show, Megan Rosenblum, who is a medical librarian, and she her expertise is anthropodermic bibliopegy. So she studies books found in human flesh. And there's a whole interesting thing there as well. But Jack, I've been keeping you for too long already. I have to ask, I close every episode by having my guests answer the same 2 questions. And I would love for your insights and your answers. All right. So I want you to think about the future. I know you spend a lot of time thinking about the past, but now you're going to switch gears. You're going to think about the future. And in whatever context is relevant to you right now, so it could be colored by where you are in your life, what's going on in society, or by, your own work, or it could be like a cosmic perspective. First, I want you to tell me, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night, the thing that you're kind of really deeply concerned, maybe pessimistic about, what's not looking good. And then on the flip side of that, what is the thing that you have a genuine and sort of authentic optimism for?
Well, I put on the spot like this. I don't think I will come up with the one, but something that pops. Well, what pops into my mind actually is, when you teach in university, you have this amazing kind of influx of people who are at a very specific point in their life, and they bring with them all of the trends and ideas of the moment. And that really puts into sharp perspective, I think, both of those questions. So on the one hand, I see the way in which this isn't probably the biggest thing in my mind, because there's already too much on our minds at the moment, but it's something that just jumps to mind, so I'll choose this. The way my students engage with technology is really amazing and terrifying. The way in which they're so deeply trained, without maybe even thinking of it that way, by the time students come to university, to think about how you find out about information. And this is with my historian's hat on, I guess, that, I'll sit down and say, well, if you didn't know something, we do some like study skill sessions as you do at the beginning of going to university. You say, well, if you didn't find something, where might you look for it if you didn't know something? And we'll be like, oh, well, I'd Google it. Okay, great. Where else? Well, I'd look at an online database. Okay, great. Where else? And normally it takes about 5 minutes for someone to say, I could go to a library and have a look at some books.
Right.
And so I do kind of, it comes back to that digital point, actually. The digitization of manuscripts is amazing, but only certain kinds of manuscripts in certain kinds of wealthy places are being digitized. So if the world goes online, what is lost in the kind of the politics of digitization? So for me, it's the pros and cons of technology that keep me up at night. The amazing potential that, I'm sitting in a room, not actually, as it turns out, very far from you, but still we're in different rooms. I'm talking into a computer and somehow we're having a conversation about objects that are 600 years old. It's an amazing thing. But then I do worry sometimes that how often can people actually get to and engage with some of those objects is something that technology can be both a huge kind of, it can make all sorts of fascinating engagements with art happen, but I also worry sometimes it can hold us back from something a bit purer and just standing and looking at something in a museum and having a kind of purer human.
Yeah, I'm sort of reminded, you bring that up in my personal experience of that. And I'm definitely like not kind of an art critic or somebody who even really collects. And I sometimes have a hard time with art museums, especially modern art museums. I'm much more interested in antiquities and I'm much more interested in kind of natural history museums. But I remember going to the Prado with my mother, having the opportunity to travel to Spain and go there, I think right after I graduated from undergrad, and seeing Hieronymus Bosch pieces and seeing that they were painted on these like old doors and tables. And I was like, this is that painting, because you never see the context. You only see the surface, the two-dimensional surface. And you think everything's on canvas. And then when you actually go and you're like, first of all, this is tiny. I had no idea it was as small as this triptych is as small as it was. Second of all, it's on this like old wood. It just gives it a whole new dimension, that it's a completely different piece in my mind now than it was had I not seen it in person.
Absolutely. Well, here's to more of those kind of experiences when lockdown ceases and we can all go out and go to museums again.
Well, Jack, thank you so much for joining me today. Guys, the book is Medieval Bodies, Life and Death in the Middle Ages, or if you're in the UK, Life, Death, and Art in the Middle Ages, I think.
Yes, that's it, yes.
Thank you so much. I had an absolute blast and I learned a lot.
It was great to chat. Thanks so much.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.